Changeable dynamic that works in the back that just is not helpful. Yes. Yes.
Move along. Are you back here, Chase? Move along.
Is it incredible to think that a private in the 23rd Georgia would have known enough to tell these guys? I mean, how long after was that Union memoir done?
That particular one actually is a fairly immediate diary. But it's a good question, and it's the kind of question you ask. Like, did Ab Tuning really get up and be able to run like that? There's lots of things like that. But there are a couple of accounts that say that there are at least two accounts on the Union side that talk about prisoners coming in and boasting kind of obtusely about what would happen next.
Okay, and then
the chances, they were probably speculating themselves.
Okay. My other question was the road that we just took was above the furnace, and excuse me for my confusion. Was that the road that Jackson took, or did he take the lower road?
I'll clarify that for everybody.
Okay,
But yeah, they took the lower road. If we can move this way so that if a car comes, we have a little bit of room to let them go by.
I have a question about
Yes.
Channing. Did his rheumatism keep him out of the Army?
Well, that and his status as an employee at a ironworks.
Well, see, the rheumatism keeps you out of the Army, but when the Army comes to you, you lose it and you can run fast. I just wondered.
I see the end of our column.
Oh my.
Well, they didn't start with that.
How long was Jackson's column when that
Probably about 8 miles, 7 to 8 miles.
Wow.
Hey, from when they left the furnace
The head of the column, it was a 12-mile march. And they left at 8, but they left from further down the road. And the first troops begin to arrive out there about 3 o'clock or so.
What was the condition of this road? How developed was it?
Well, what's that? I'll answer that one when everybody comes up.
Second, we're close to done, or is it because you want to be done?
Everybody okay?
You want to be done?
Yep. Couple of questions about the road. We're now walking on Jackson Trail. Now the road, in fact, the road that we were walking on along the top, remember, there was a road network that fed the kind of delivery end of the furnace, and a road network that served the product end of the furnace, the production end. The road that fed that served the production end, in other words, that was built to carry stuff away, is the road network that Jackson was using. Jackson was not on the road that we just walked on. He was on this road, the low road. The upper road that we were just on, we just took a shortcut and came down. It actually comes out right here. When you pass this point, you can look down and you can see the road that leads from here up to Hazel Grove. It's very vivid. It also is probably about the same dimensions that this road was on May 2nd, 1862. In other words, not much wider than four people marching abreast in it. So it was not a highway, it was not a plank road, it was not a macadamized turnpike like the Valley Pike. It was a woods road, and not much improved at all. I just want to stop here. Of course, as we go along now, we're walking Jackson's flank march. We're doing it about an hour or so. What time is it now? It's almost exactly 2 o'clock in 1862, or 1863 rather. It's about 2 minutes after 2 o'clock in Jackson's time, and so we will be marching at about the same time and pace that the last wagons coming through here were at exactly this moment 150 years ago. But here the road has turned to the south more, and will turn more to the south as we go on up here. The marching this day was arduous but not terribly fast. It took about 7 hours to cover 12 miles. For those of you who know anything about Jackson, that is not a rapid pace. Part of that is due to the constriction of the road network and the difficulty of getting wagons along as well. It was also a hot day. One man in Jackson's command, an artilleryman, said early the next morning we were in this march, and at one point we were drawn aside to let the infantry pass. The men had been in winter quarters and accumulated much plunder which they were trying to carry, but the day was a warm one and they were pushed to the utmost. The officers continually called, close up, and enforced the order. As they passed us in a dog trot, many of these poor fellows stepped aside, jerked off their knapsacks or bundles, hastily selected a few precious things and abandoned their cherished possessions and ran on to resume their places. Several men saw Jackson along the way, and of course they would write about this in their memoirs. One man said he rode along in his usual unstudied manner, wearing a common oilcloth over his shoulders and with his hat drawn down over his eyes. He looked forward more eagerly than I had ever seen him do, and there appeared to be more of a wonted contraction of his lips than I had seen. We rose on the point, I felt, of breaking out into a cheer. But reading his haste and his stern look, we contented ourselves with gazing at him and giving expression to our foolish speculations. You asked about certainly the men in the ranks were speculating where they were going, although they did not know. He passed at once to the right, where soon after artillery opened on the enemy. He's talking about down here. So that's the scene here, a warm day. And we're going to continue on to the unfinished road. It's about 400 yards down the road here. If we could stay to the right and try to keep a lane clear, that would be great. If we can get our skirmisher out front and one out back, that would be great.
Done at Catharine Furnace.
There was back in the 1930s, and then there was a lesser one in the 1970s. But there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done there. We mapped it a couple years ago for the first time. But we don't understand everything up here.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's still kind of leaping ahead chronologically. Who on your staff would you recommend would be the best person to talk about Laurel Hill?
Well, it used to be Mac Wyckoff, but probably Frank. I'm going to see if yeah, Frank probably has the most, and Greg as well. Greg wrote the Blue and Gray issues on that. So.
John?
Yeah.
If someone was to walk today, Jackson Street, would it take them 7 hours?
If you were walking by yourself, it shouldn't take you 7 hours. You should be able to go much faster. Except you might end up dead because of the cars.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the traffic. All right, how's everybody doing? We have 2 more stops. This one, I just want to warn you, this is where we bushwhack. In the olden days, we would have gone on, the unfinished railroad crosses the road right in front of us here, but so many trees are down that you can't even tell that it's there. It looks a little squirrely here, but when you get up in the woods, it's really pretty open in the woods. But we're going to do that, and then we're going to come back out very quickly, and we'll go to the Wellford House site, which is just around the bend in the road here. All right, so I'm going up through the woods here. Me, certainly all of you, hopefully having slogged your way through all of that, will get a chance to get a look at it. In fact, neither Eric nor I have ever been up here before today, so we just we made this decision this morning to come up here because you can't see it from down there.
That's Orange and Fredericksburg.
This is the Fredericksburg, what is the Potomac, Fredericksburg, and Piedmont Railroad. Conceived in 1854. Story very similar to the railroad, unfinished railroad at Manassas. Part of a railroad boom, a lot of independent small companies growing up in the 1850s. And it's just mayhem. They build lines parallel to each other, a few miles apart, all that sort of thing. And either by the late 1850s or at the time of the war, many of them are out of business. So this excavation has been engineered entirely by the time of the war. Abutments, everything's ready except the track has not been laid.
Is this the same one goes by the wilderness?
This is the same one that goes through the wilderness. If you walk down here about 4 miles, you'll be in the place where Longstreet used this, coming in the opposite direction from where we are today. Now after the war, this was finished and was a working railroad for about 50 years or so. It was a narrow gauge railroad that ran from Orange into Fredericksburg. The tracks were torn up in 1938. So it's known widely hereabouts as the Virginia Central Railroad. Not to be confused with the Virginia Central Railroad of wartime, which of course was a major railroad off to our south here. But the presence of this excavation was a great benefit to the Confederates on this day. Now remember, Colonel Best left 45 men back at the furnace. They are captured and hauled north to Hazel Grove. But Sickles' men of the 3rd Corps, the United States sharpshooters and other units, continued to pursue the 23rd Georgia along the path that we just followed. In fact, following mostly on the north side of the road, which is to say this side of the road. The Georgians get into this area, and either they knew about it in advance or someone told them about it, or they just came upon it, this excavation, which as you can see even today is 7 or 8, 9 feet deep. At the time, of course, the sides of it, just as the excavation of Manassas would be much steeper than they are now. Now why they selected here was because it was a natural cut. This cut, as you go off to our kind of northwest and off to the southeast, peters out to flatness, which doesn't offer much protection. But it's on the north side of the road here that it is a cut. And so the Georgians, about 280 of them, tumble back through what was an open field at the time. The woods on the other side of the stream we crossed back there. They tumble back and into this excavation. They immediately start digging out toe holds on the side walls so they can elevate themselves high enough to shoot over the top. Not all the men do this, but some do, and the rest of them commit to loading weapons and passing them up. Those must have been interesting conversations as to who was going to get which job on this day.
What kind of rifles do you know?
Pardon me?
What kind of rifles do you know?
I'm not sure what I'm not sure what kind they had. Now, Berdan's men had Sharps rifles, which were breech loading rifles. One of Berdan's men said, "Our boys were deployed as skirmishers at half distance, or about 6 feet apart, and advanced in that shape and drove the rebels before them. There was a full brigade of rebels in front of them, not quite, but owing to our boys' superior arms and marksmanship, they drove them, and having got them started, we didn't give them a chance to stop and load their rifles, but just shoved them right along." Of course, he's talking about the movement from the furnace to this point, so they're shoving them right along. Now, by this time, there are other Confederate troops who are responding to this emerging little emergency along the rear of the Confederate column. There is 3 artillery pieces in the Wellford field, which I'll show you in just a second. There's 2 regiments of Archers Brigade, including the 14th Tennessee, that are in the woods off to our left here. In fact, a couple of companies eventually get into the unfinished railroad with these men. But the Union fire across this field where we're standing was pretty severe, and it kept the Georgians down. One of the sharpshooters, Union sharpshooters, said, "The 23rd Georgia took refuge in what we supposed at the time to be a railroad cut. A portion of the 1st sharpshooters lay behind the fence and trees along the highway," which of course is the road that we just came up on. The sharpshooters with their breech-loading rifles made the fire so hot that the 23rd Georgia dare not show their heads. But their orders were, the Georgians, to hold this place. One of the Georgians said, "At that time that we were firing and to cut, the force of the enemy was much greater than ours, and our position was such that we could not get out of it without many killed." Remember, it peters out on the ends. And so to get out, you've got to climb up, over the top, and over this open ground. The command was not in danger from the fire of the enemy while it was in the cut, except the men who were on the edge of the cut firing. They were exposed. Those men below handed guns to those above and fired on the enemy. Pretty soon the Tennesseans, the 2 companies of Tennesseans that were off to the left over here, my left, withdrew. And so now 270 or so men of the 23rd Georgia are in this cut by themselves. No protection on their left. In fact, no cut or fill on their left. No protection or cut or fill on their right either. Now, Colonel Best said that when the Tennesseans left, he decided that in order to preserve his regiment and to continue the fight, he needed to withdraw. He said that, or he felt that the regiment could do no good down in this cut here, and he decided to withdraw. He says he gave the order, but many of the Georgians down here never heard it and were surprised to see, after about a half hour in the cut, Colonel Best, down on the left of the line, with about 40 men, scramble up over the top and make a run back to the Wellford house.
I hope he was Private Best the next week.
Well, we'll talk about that. Now, Best thought that the courageous thing to do at the moment was to brave the fire that would inevitably come once they crawled out of the embankment and try to preserve the regiment. But here's an instance where the concept of courage and the concept of honor collided with each other unhappily. The men in the cut, who would eventually surrender, all felt that the colonel should have stayed. They never got the order to go. And so, eventually, the Yankees were able to sweep forward, and they captured more than 250 men of the 23rd Georgia in this cut, aiming down into the cut where Rob Hodge is right now, enforcing their surrender. The Georgians showed a white flag, which is what compelled the Yankees forward, and these Georgians were eventually hauled off to the rear. Now, what about Colonel Best? He weighed courage versus honor. He felt he had done the courageous thing by braving the fire. These men never had to brave that fire. But men in the regiment and officers in the regiment filed charges against him because he did not do, in their eyes, his duty. He said he gave the order for the regiment to withdraw, but he didn't stay long enough to ensure that the order was carried out. And so he was accused of abandoning his regiment at this moment. The following fall, he was court-martialed, and he was not Private Best, he was Citizen Best. He was cashiered from the service of the Confederate States Army for what happened here. Now, as the Confederates left here, or as Best men left here, and as these men surrendered, of course, all that remained between here and the rear of the column at first were 3 artillery pieces in the Wellford yard. But more yet Confederates would soon show up. But I want to take you to the Wellford house, not so much because of any fighting that went there, but because of what goes on there before this. And we're going to go quickly. We've got to get back here pretty quick. So we're going to head back out to the road. Wellford house is just about 100 yards or so down the road. And then we will break there and head back. "23rd colors got out, yes."
Why didn't the men follow the colors?
Well, because they didn't have orders to. And they may not have seen it as well. Remember, you're talking about 250 men would cover a front over 100 yards. And that's not insignificant.
And they didn't lose the flag.
They did not lose the flag. All right. Oh, we still have some people coming. You are encouraged to look at other people's backsides. We don't normally do that in the government, but after that little trek, we do encourage it as much as you can, and do it gracefully, of course. All right. We are standing in a much smaller clearing than what existed here in 1863. This is the Wellford Farm, an adjunct to the furnace. You can imagine fairly easily, I think, how hard it would have been to feed 86 slaves, whatever contingent of free labor was working here, way out here in the middle of nowhere. it's easy to imagine that the farm here, part of about 1,100 acres that the Wellfords owned out here, was integral to feeding the people who worked at the furnace itself. The house stood about midway up the slope in front of us here. There's a big depression in the field there. You have a picture of the house taken in the 1930s and showing, giving you a really good idea of the trail, Jackson Trail, before it was improved by the Park Service. I think it's safe to say that if we got the Jackson Trail today as it was in the early part of the century, we would not have done to it what you see done to it today. We might have built a road next to it and left the trail much as it had been. Now, we talked along the way here, these collisions of ideas that kind of come together to help us tell a bigger story. And this is one of those collisions here. And that is here, the collision of these immense military events and the people who lived on this land. The Wellford family was primarily seated in Fredericksburg. But of course, in December of 1862, many of the residents of Fredericksburg had left. In fact, by the spring of 1863, less than 30% of the residents of Fredericksburg were still in their homes in April of 1863. And when it looked like things were going to get going again with the commencement of the spring campaign, more of them left, including the Wellfords. And they refugeed. They were one of the few families in Fredericksburg who had their own place to refugee too. And that was the house that stood here in this field. By now, John Spotswood Wellford was dead, and his son, Charles C. Wellford, was managing the operation. And remember, the furnace itself was a fledgling operation. On April 30th, the Yankees arrived at Chancellorsville. And of course, as armies do when they arrive someplace, they send people out to look around, to see what's out there, to see what can be learned. And one of the places Union cavalry visited on August 30th was the Wellford place. Evelina Wellford, who was one of the nieces in the house here, wrote, "The Yankees were down at the furnace not a mile from us. Indeed, they were all around and shouting and shooting, as we, four unprotected females, were expecting them in any moment. As soon as they came near, Uncle C and Charlie, her brother and her uncle, made their escape to the woods. We sat up all night looking for the Yankees, but they did not come until Friday morning, when at different times about 20 visited us, searching the house for arms and Confederates, shooting the fowls and stealing the provisions, of which we had scant supply. Several who came behaved very well and did us no harm whatsoever. They seemed very confident of success and thought Richmond was almost within their grasp. Of course, we were amused at their boasting and gave them to understand as much." Now, the abuse of Yankees by women was an art form in this part of the world, as it was in Petersburg and Richmond when they came into contact. In fact, many Southern women felt it a duty to make Union soldiers as uncomfortable as they could. So the verbiage that you sometimes hear about emerging from Confederate women toward Yankees wasn't always just kind of this spontaneous personal reaction. There was, certainly in Fredericksburg, a concerted, concentrated, if not coordinated effort to abuse the Yankees as much as possible. And so these women were well schooled at it, but it wasn't for fun or sport, it was all that they could do. And so they did. And you see it over and over that again. Now on May 1st, Jeb Stuart arrived here. He made his headquarters in this house. And if you remember, this is where Channing Price was brought after he was so severely wounded in the back of the leg up at above the furnace, a short distance from here. And it would be in this house up on the slope there where that fellow's standing. He's marking the house site for us very nicely now, by the way. It was there that Channing Price died. Now, the Wellford house would be a nice footnote, except for what happened here on the night of May 1st into the morning of May 2nd. You remember the conference, the Cracker Box Conference, back at the junction of the Plank Road and the Furnace Road, where Lee and Jackson are trying to figure out how to get at those people. They want to go to the left. They explore what they know of the roads, and they can't find the way that they want to go. But Jackson's chaplain is a man named Beverly Tucker Lacey. Beverly Tucker Lacey's brother lives, well, he's gone now, but he lived at a place called Elwood, which still stands on the Wilderness Battlefield. Lacey knew this ground fairly well, but if he didn't know it, he knew someone who did. And when Jackson sought, along with his map maker Jedediah Hotchkiss, more information about what was available in the way of roads in this part of the world, Lacey suggested they go visit the Wellfords. And by this time, on the night of May 1st, the Confederates were here. Charles Wellford and his father had returned to the house, and Jedediah Hotchkiss and a couple of other Confederates gathered in the house with the family to map out the roads that could be used by Jackson the next morning. And they did. Jedediah Hotchkiss said, reaching Mr. Wellford's, I aroused him from his bed and soon learned that he himself had recently opened a road through the woods in a direction for the purpose of hauling cordwood and iron ore to his furnace. Again, the connection between the furnace and the road network here. This I drew on my map, and having asked Mr. Wellford if he would act as a guide if it became necessary to march over the road, I returned to headquarters. When I reached those, I found General Lee and Jackson in conference, each seated on a cracker box from a pile that had been left there by the Federals the day before. And so that night, based on information gotten from the Wellfords on this site and carried back to the cracker box conference or gathering at the intersection, the final pieces of Jackson's plan were put into place. Jackson's men passed here late on the morning of May 2nd, and they would continue to pass here, of course, for probably 4 to 5 hours. Probably the head of the column gets here maybe about 10 or so, maybe about 9 to 10, and they continue on for several hours. Saturday morning, the niece, Evelina, writes, Saturday morning, Jackson with his army passed through, making that grand flank movement. We met with many of our friends and enjoyed it, of course, feeling so secure, too, against any more trouble that day from the Yankees. And, of course, there was always great excitement and comfort for local residents if they were of Confederate sympathies. And by the way, not all were here. There were a lot of Union sympathizers in this part of Spotsylvania County. But it was a great comfort, of course, to have the Confederate Army around. But things quickly changed when the 23rd Georgia starts tumbling back and the Yankees start tumbling forward. Artillery sets up right in the field here, 3 guns firing over the heads of the men in the unfinished railroad in front of them. More infantry, more men from Jackson's column turned back to hold back these Union troops back here. The attack made by the enemy, and again, this is Evelina, brought on a battle on this very spot. In expectation of some trouble, the carts were waiting at the door, and our trunks and some valuables being put in and sent off, we hurriedly took our departure for the woods, making as good time as you might imagine under the circumstances. The shells came whizzing by, bursting near us, and you may judge that our feelings were not of the most comfortable kind. So these 4 women take to the woods. We've never really been able to figure out where they go. They find a house and refugee there for a time, and then they return here on May 3rd. They found everything in great confusion, the house having been occupied by both parties since the previous day. We lost a great deal by their occupation, but not as much as we might have expected. I think, however, a few more moves of this kind will break us up entirely, she wrote shortly after the battle. And indeed, of course, the presence of the armies, Union and Confederate, would be a weight upon this land that it would literally take decades to recover from. The mere presence, the Confederates, even setting aside the passage of Union armies here, the presence of Confederate armies here was enough to leave the land in woeful condition at the end of the war. There was very little food available for residents here. Agriculture had come to a stop. Fortunes made were lost during the war. Slaves by the thousands ran away. In fact, my estimates are that by 1864, 75% of the slaves in Spotsylvania had left. And proved thereby Lincoln's assertion that by diminishing and abolishing slavery, they would also diminish the ability of the South to resist. And in fact, it would prove to be so. As for the Wellfords in 1860, They had owned $20,000 worth of real estate and $46,000 in personal property. Most of it slaves, of course. In 1870, this same household owned $22,000 in real estate, but only $1,000 in personal property. Of course, most of that from the exodus of slaves. The war would hang heavily on Spotsylvania for a long time. So, from the furnace, we see the efforts of our community to grow and prosper, the intersection of industry and landscape that shapes the human experience of battle. Here, we see the conflict between hope, Hooker's hope that the Confederates were retreating, and the reality that Jackson wasn't retreating at all. 150 years ago, this minute, the head of Jackson's column was pulling up on the Orange Turnpike and started to go into position, preparing for an attack that would follow about 2 hours later. And so, the story would go on. Our next program's at 5 o'clock, Jackson's flank attack. I hope you can make it. If not that, I hope you can make it to the Jackson Moonton program, which is a sit and listen program, by the way. So bring a chair if you've got one. But as it is, we're free form back to the cars. Thank you.